This is Dan Ferrisi, editor of Sound and Communications. Happy to be joined this afternoon by Pete Putman, our longtime columnist, who is also kind of a legend in the AV industry, having had a 44-year career in a whole bunch of different avenues of AV profession. And he's getting ready to retire at the end of 2021. So we wanted to talk a little bit about his career, about his what he's taking away from it, what he'll miss, some of the changes he's seen over those decades. So thank you so much for joining us, Pete, and thank you so much for all the contributions you've made to Sound and Communications this past decade.
My pleasure, Dan. And if my memory serves correctly, I've been writing for you for about 10 years.
Absolutely. And it's kind of been an anchor of the issue, always right opposite cover 3, and something I know a lot of people look forward to. So we're going to miss you, and I think the AV industry is going to miss you. But let's talk a little bit about why you're deciding now is the time to step away after 44 years, doing a lot of different things, having a lot of achievements. Why is now the time you're ready to move on to the next chapter in your life?
Well, there are a few reasons for it. Number one probably is I don't really have the fire for it that I used to years ago. It's just not as exciting as it used to be. And I know people have a hard time believing that. I know people have commented on LinkedIn, I thought you'd never leave the industry. You seem so pumped up about it. But you reach a point in life, and I'm at that point in life now where you just want to indulge other interests. You want to do other things besides review projectors at the shootout or write columns about wireless and video compression and teach classes at InfoComm and do all kinds of crazy setups like those Super Bowl HD TV parties. Maybe just a little less hardware in my life, little more real world stuff, more nature, more traveling. It's really kind of hard to put my finger on it. It just felt right. Just felt like it was the right time to do it.
And I know certainly you have a host of non-AV related interests that occupy your time. And you're also a family man, have a grandchild. So I'm sure there's going to be plenty of things to keep you occupied. Do you want to touch on some of the highlights of your career? And I mean, we could talk for hours about this because you've had so many, but what would you say are maybe one of the 2 or 3 best moments you've had, or things you're really going to look back fondly on years from now?
Hard to pin down some, but I will say that here's a couple. When I was teaching at InfoComm, and I've related this anecdote before, so before I continue with it, I should mention that I do remember when I was graduating high school, my best friend growing up, we're still very good friends. He's a chief security officer for an internet company. We were asking about where we thought we'd go in life. I said, well, I know one thing for sure. I'm never going to have a job where I have to wear a suit and a tie. I'm never going to work in a fast food restaurant, and I refuse to be a teacher. Well, I did have to wear a job. I did have a job where I had to wear a suit and tie for a year when I worked at American Express. And of course, I taught classes at InfoComm for at least 20, if not more years. I kind of lost track. So I guess 1 out of 3 isn't bad. I never worked in a fast food restaurant. But when InfoComm started up what they called the Super Tuesday sessions, and I decided I'm going to have some fun with this. I'm going to just kind of take people on a wild, wacky drive through the world of technology, prognosticating, criticizing, praising, telling you all the funny things that go on. And to do that in front of a large audience, which I know sometimes we had hundreds and hundreds of people, maybe 600-800 people in a room, and to get such an enthusiastic response from everybody was very, very rewarding, especially the years that I did my first 10 or so PowerPoints in 3D. The year I did the whole thing off a wireless laptop. Did some crazy demonstrations that I wasn't sure they were going to work. And fortunately, they did most of the time. And as a corollary to that, I will say that I was asked back in the mid-90s to do some public speaking based on the writing I was doing for a trade magazine. And I was terrified of getting up on stage. And I found the more I did it, the more I actually enjoyed it. I put a lot of work into it, but I felt very comfortable getting up in front of a crowd and even just sort of riffing like a jazz musician, just taking a topic and going with it for 10, 15, 20, even 30 minutes. So I would say that was very rewarding. I would also say being able to travel, to go to Europe, to Asia, to South America. I did teach a class once for many students in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and with simultaneous translation, that was quite a logistical mess to get through, but it worked. That was very rewarding. And I would also say that I have a corollary to that would be that I've been a ham radio operator for 51 years. I don't do much with it now, but I'm still active with it. So to get the highest ranking amateur license, which is the amateur extra, which some people considered to be even tougher than the old FCC first radio telephone license. That was an achievement. That had me pretty pumped up when I passed that test, and I've had it ever since December of 1981. So I'm coming up on 40 years with that license.
Very cool. So I know that you are an AVIXA, formerly InfoComm Educator of the Year, and you, as you said, taught for about 20 years these various classes at trade shows. What would you say are some of the keys to being a really good AV industry educator, be it in the context of a trade show, be it in the context of writing educational content? How do you find, what are the keys to being an effective AV educator?
Effective. I know that I typically got, not bragging here, I typically got pretty high scores on my instructor evaluation sheets. But teaching made me appreciate just how hard teaching is and how hard my best teachers worked to make the classes interesting. Mm-hmm. If it was me and I was sitting in a class, sometimes I'd fall asleep. I'd get bored. So I thought, I've got to get everybody's interest and hold it, but I want to do what I call experiential learning. There are people out there that can see equations on a blackboard, numbers, like my father, who was a chemical engineer and a very good one, and understand exactly what's being explained. But in my case, I actually had to take some solder and some components and build something and turn it on and see it work before I understood the concepts behind it. Mm-hmm. So I thought, why not do the same thing for my classes? Why not bring in a lot of hardware and set up these elaborate demos and say, I'm going to tell you about this process, but I'm also going to show you how it works, and we're going to have audience participation. So that was one thing. Another thing I learned is 50% of effective teaching is entertaining, whether people want to admit it or not. You've got a large group of people, and I've taught classes for groups as large as 250, which is quite challenging. That's like a lecture hall, is to grab their attention, but keep them interested, keep them engaged, ask them questions, walk up to people and say, what do you think about this? Walk up to somebody else and say, do you understand how this works? Bring people up to the front. So there's an entertainment process to it too. And the main reason I started teaching was that when you go to a trade show, you're going from one table to another. And what are you usually getting most of the time? You're getting a marketing pitch. It's the marketing and salespeople that are out front. Well, if you're well-versed in technology, and I'd like to think I know a little bit about it, you have a good BS detector. And I was so afraid that people would be taken in by things that were stretching the truth or flat out untruths, exaggerations about a product, that I said, I need to teach. And I need to say to people, look, I want you, when you leave this class, to ask better questions. That was my motto. Mm-hmm. When you go down to the trade show floor, be it InfoComm, NAB, ISE, IBC, whatever the shows you're at, I want you to ask better questions. I want you to understand how the technology works so that you're not asking, gee, how does this work? But, okay, tell me how I can integrate this into a project that I have, knowing that these are limitations of things that it can and cannot do. Mm-hmm. I said, at that point, the marketing and sales people will basically back off and bring up the engineering people. And that's the conversation you've wanted to have from the beginning. You want to get the facts. You want to know if the product will do what you want it to do. You want to know what its limitations are, what its strengths are, so that you make better buying decisions. So really my emphasis was ask better questions. And when you do make a purchase and when you have that equipment running or that process running in your system, you're satisfied with it knowing, yeah, I bought the best thing for me at that time. It's doing what I need it to do. I didn't get sucked into the hype and buy something that I found out later is totally inappropriate for an installation. And that's really what teaching should be all about. My favorite instructors, the instructors that I worked with when I was a member of the Professional Education and Training Committee and also InfoComm faculty, were the ones that focused on the technology and not on brands and not manufacturer-specific training, but they were focusing on how does the underlying technology work. If you understand that, when you go out on the show floor, you're going to find 10 companies basically selling the same thing. So what you want to ask them is, how is your flavor of ice cream different than that company's flavor of ice cream? Knowing that you're basically all trying to sell me ice cream, if you follow that analogy.
Right. So another part of educating is not just teaching in classes, but kind of, as I said before, writing. And a lot of your columns and features over the years have been pretty educational, if not, just of an analytical nature. So if you're writing for us for about 10 years, you've probably written about 120 columns, maybe another dozen or more features beyond that. What is the process that you went through, and since you're not done yet with the writing that you're still going through, to come up with good, incisive content that other people haven't written about, because you don't want to tread the same ground others have? What's been your secret to generating 120 plus great pieces of writing? And that's just for sound and communications.
Yeah, well, I really have honestly lost track of how many written pieces I've done for trade magazines, websites, and things over the years. It's got to be in the hundreds and hundreds, and maybe even approaching 1,000. I don't know.
Mhm.
Um, the thing about writing is that that's not something I thought I would be any good at, but I started doing it for ham radio magazines in the late 70s, early 80s. And then as as I mentioned in the story that I wrote for you, I kind of stumbled into this industry by accident by reading an article that was full of technical flaws, calling up the editor and saying, how can you publish something like this when you have so many technical mistakes? Where's your technical proofreader? And his challenge was, well, if you're so smart, why don't you write something for me? And of course, back then that was the era of fax machines. And I had written a piece for a nonprofit, an association in the industry that no longer exists. And as soon as I hung up, I faxed it to him, and he's like, wow, you're good. How'd you like to join the staff?
Hmm.
So then my first thought was, okay, how am I going to come up with an idea every month? Well, you'd be surprised if you, to quote my favorite baseball player of all time, Yogi Berra, you can observe a lot by watching. I knew what he meant. And what he meant was just read, watch TV, but read, pay attention to the news, pay attention to technology trends. Most of my best ideas for columns came from going to trade shows and seeing people hyping products and everything and not seeing a rational explanation of them anywhere, or a good explanation. I'm figuring, all right, then I'll explain how it works. Sometimes just inspiration hit me. Sometimes I'd be working out, doing my twice a week swim workout. I swim a mile twice a week to stay fit. And you'd be surprised. Your mind just wanders while you're doing that. And all of a sudden, boom, a story just pops into your head. So it's, some writers have described it to me as a sort of vomiting up your ideas onto paper, letting them sit for a day, then go back and editing them and saying, okay, there's a coherent story here. I will admit that with every editor I've ever worked at, there have been times when I know the deadline was looming and I thought, I haven't got a clue what I'm going to write about. So I would just leave the word processor and go play music, or go take a walk, or get out in the car and motor around, or go do something else where I'm not thinking about writing. And sure enough, after a period of time, your brain, that part of your brain is turning like gears. Something pops up like, you know what, you haven't written about wireless HDMI in a while, or you haven't written about video compression in a while, or you really should talk about the trends in micro LED displays. And you sit down, you think, yep, there's a story there, and boom, it comes out on paper. And many of the columns I've written for you have run long, and I've had to trim them back because I'm used to writing features, which are typically 2,000 to 3,000 words. And the column is, of course, going to be a lot shorter. So is there a key to the process? I can't tell you. It's different for everybody else. I'm sure it's no different than people that write historical works, biographies, fiction, nonfiction. You just never know where your inspiration is going to come from. Sometimes you go around a corner, it hits you right in the face.
Yeah, didn't know that was your secret. Take the top down on the sports car, drive a little bit, all of a sudden the idea pops into your mind.
Oh, I've had ideas on vacation. I had an idea for an article once trying to climb Mount Rainier. I had several ideas for articles flying over to visit a company in Korea a few years ago. And I just jotted them down. When I came back, there was like 2 or 3 columns right there.
So in the 4 decades or so that you've been in the industry, obviously you've seen a lot of change. This goes without saying, technological change, but also the industry itself is evolving. For example, we've started to become a little bit less focused on specsmanship and a little bit more about the experience and like being storytellers, being memory makers. What changes would you say have been for the industry's betterment? What changes would you say have been to the industry's detriment? You have kind of a unique perspective, having been in the industry for a number of decades. What makes you excited about the direction we're moving, and what makes you hesitant about the direction we're moving?
Well, first off, when I started working in the industry way back in 1978, this was a very clunky, mechanical, hardware-based industry. Back then, I was programming multiple 35 millimeter slide projectors to do multi-image slideshows. And that was a process that required not only the projectors, but dissolver controls and stands and miles of cabling and these big boxes, which are called dissolve controllers, and then a computer to run everything, and a tape deck to play back the program. And I mean, it was just a big, big mess of hardware that today you can replace with a laptop. I mean, you can basically do the same thing on a laptop. So the overarching trend, and then there's 2 that go hand in hand here, but the overarching trend is that hardware is not really that important anymore so much as software is. And I think we all know that hardware, which used to be very expensive and sometimes very bulky, and cost a lot of money, which was great for people building up huge trade show booths because they were selling tons of these products. Hardware is cheap now. I've often said in my classes that hardware is cheap and anyone can make it. And it's true. Hardware is cheap and anyone can make it. I just bought a cheap lavalier microphone today for 25 bucks. I mean, a good lavalier mic 30 years ago, that was several $100s. And this is not a particularly great mic, but for my purposes, it'll do. But the other thing is that we started to see, and really the display industry was what was driving this. We started to see in the late 90s, the consumer technology leading professional technology. Mm-hmm. Normally, the path for migration was, it was introduced as a very expensive professional product. Then it trickled down to the consumer market. Then it became cheaper. Then everybody started to adopt it. So for example, my first VHS deck was $685. And VHS is an obsolete format. My first DVD player was $700. If you can find DVD players nowadays, they sell for like 15 bucks or something. Anybody even uses them anymore. So in the late 90s and as the turn of the century into the aughts, the advances were coming in consumer technology. So DVD, then HD DVD, then Blu-ray, and digital television broadcasting, and then things like smartphones and tablets and video streaming. These are all innovations that came out of consumer electronics, which from the standpoint of a manufacturer who plays in both fields, that's a much, much larger, by several orders of magnitude, much, much larger market to sell product into than the professional market. Mm-hmm. But what happened at the same time was that the prices for professional products started to drop. So for example, right now I'm speaking to you on a digital SLR. It's a Panasonic Lumix. And I think brand new, they sell for something like 900 bucks. But I was able to get a package price on one for $600 or $700 that included the lens and a little bag to put it in, and some extra SD cards and all, which just reinforces what I said. Hardware is cheap and anybody can make it. And of course, today we're using more and more of our own personal devices to communicate, and not so much the expensive video cameras. Those video cameras that had 5 and sometimes 6-figure price tags, you can now buy a decent video camera for less than $1,000. You can buy a really good one for less than $2,000. But hand in hand, because we can shoot video on smartphones, we can shoot video on pretty much anything, the sales of those products have gone down. Right now, if you're playing in the AV and broadcast space, the most valuable, the most useful camera you can buy is a pan-tilt zoom camera. You can do an entire broadcast news set using pan-tilt zoom cameras. They're that good. You don't even need to have a camera operator. You just need to have one person sitting there remotely panning, tilting, and zooming and switching between cameras. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing from a hardware standpoint because it's simplified things. The problem now is that there's a difference between understanding what makes good video and what makes acceptable video and what makes crappy video. There's no better example than that, than the fact that our TVs and screens that we watch on are all oriented in a landscape format. Yet how often do you see vertically oriented video? People don't think about it. They pull out their smartphone and they start recording because they see something like a tornado, which passed through here about a week ago, mm-hmm. or some accident or some other event going on. So of course the news media has had to adapt to that, and they have little colored barriers or borders that they put on these things like drapes. But understanding how to light for good video, understanding how to get good audio is still disciplines that are worth pursuing and worth mastering, as opposed to, when you're using Zoom, the video is okay. And sometimes the audio is not so great. But in my case, this is an instrument, it's a Sennheiser musical instrument microphone, which also works great for vocals. And at DSLR, and I'm running that through my computer to give you better audio and better video. Could the lighting be a little better? Yeah, well, that's because of some limitations with the auto iris in my camera. So while technology has gotten cheaper and it's gotten easier to use, and there's less of a learning curve to be able to take something out of the box and put it to work, there are also some disciplines I think that are being lost in the process. The understanding of, can you get better video? Can you get better audio? How should you light something? How can you make it look as good as you possibly can and sound as good as you possibly can? And I would say one field that I think is suffering from that more than anything else is something that's been basically my love for 50 something years or even more. And that's RF and wireless, because we just largely take it for granted that anything we pump into the ether is going to get from point A to point B, that our wireless mics are going to work, that we're going to be able to stream, video over a Wi-Fi connection, that the Wi-Fi connection is even going to work, that all these other wireless gadgets that we have, we just turn them on and somehow they're smart enough to configure themselves and they're always going to work. But not understanding the limitations of those systems, the bandwidth limitations, the signal distance limitations, the things that can make those systems screw up and go haywire. That's really my main concern as I exit the industry is, where's that teaching going to come from? I taught a lot of that. I don't know who's going to teach it in my wake.
So obviously, as I was saying at the outset, you have a very rich life, a very full life. So it's not like you necessarily need the AV industry to give you purpose or give you meaning. But if there's anything about the AV industry that you would think maybe 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now, you might say, I really miss X. I really miss Y. What might that be? The thing you would really kind of miss about being part of this AV community on an active day-to-day basis?
Well, I have to say, I did enjoy teaching. I did enjoy watching things fail during class and having to improvise and work around it and keep the class going and keep people's attention. But I would say mostly the interaction with my colleagues and friends at trade shows and at conferences. There's nothing really more fun than to walk the show floor at, say, something like the Consumer Electronics Show, and then run into somebody and spend the next 15 minutes arguing about the merits of some technology that you just saw, or if it's actually going to work, or if it's just hype, or it's the next, as we like to call it, the solar powered nightlight that when you think about it makes no sense. And of course I won't have that. I'm prepared for that. I would say to anybody that works in any industry, no matter how immersed you are in it, that it's very, really important to have two sets of contacts, social contacts, friends, colleagues, whatever you want to call them, and they can overlap. But you'd have the ones that you have within the industry that you work in, but you should have an equally large or a strong bedrock of contacts and friends that you have that are not in the industry that you work in. And in some cases have no idea what you do and frankly don't care about it, which is even better. So for my purposes, playing music has done that for me. I've met a lot of people, made a lot of friends playing music. I'm a member of 2 railroad historical societies, so I have some friends there. I'm not as active with ham radio as I used to be, but I have some friends that are hams, as I found out a lot of them are on LinkedIn. And also, when I got my Miata back in 2016, I joined the local Miata club, and they're very active. We go out and we'll drive 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 miles and then finish for lunch. And we'll just take backcountry drives and have a lot of fun with that. And so none of these people have anything to do with the audiovisual broadcast or cinema industries. And that's the way I really would like to have it and keep it that way.
I didn't think that you would say the year you spent. I know you calculated how many days you'd spent in Las Vegas over however many decades. I didn't think you would say that you were going to miss the year you spent in Las Vegas.
Well, funny how that came about. There is a technology conference that I highly recommend. I love going to it every year. The Hollywood Professional Association Technology Retreat, which is going to be the 3rd weekend in February. It was virtual last year. I hope that they can have it again this year. There's some really smart people that show up there, lots of ad hoc, sidebar conversations, great presentations, really thought-provoking stuff. And somebody asked me one year, gee, you show a lot of pictures and talk a lot about having to go on to Vegas. Have you ever figured out how much time you spent out there? I thought, well, that's a really good question. Well, I have stored somewhere in my basement a box that is piled probably that high or more with badges from conferences. I don't think I have every one, but I have most of them. And I thought, gee, I wonder how many of these were in Vegas. So of course I went through that box one day. Then I went online and looked in my, went back and looked through, going all the way back to 1994 when I started going to trade shows. And I calculated that I had been to Las Vegas closing in on 90 times. So I thought, all right, what was my average stay out there? Well, my average stay for a show like NEB is I would come out on a Sunday night and I'd be there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and fly home Thursday afternoon. For InfoComm, I come in on a Monday, I'd teach Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, fly home on Friday. I started adding all the days up and I realized I've been there more than 365 days. Oh my God. Somebody had told me you're going to spend a year of your life in Las Vegas. I would have said, you're out of your mind. That is never going to happen. And it happened. And I've actually spent more than 365 days out there. So that was a sobering thought. But keep in mind, for example, back in 1999, in the year 2000, I made 5 trips out there because in 1999, it was CES, followed by the Show West, that's the cinema show, followed by NAB, followed by InfoComm, followed by Comdex. And then I believe that InfoComm back to back was in Vegas for 2 years under that particular administration. So I repeated the same thing. So in the space of, say, January of 1999 till November of 2000, I made 10 trips out there, 10 trips out to the show. So you can see how this stuff starts to pile up. And of course, there were dealer events that I was invited to speak at. There were other things that happened out in Vegas. As a matter of fact, the year I got the Educator of the Award year, that was in Las Vegas. So yeah, I have stayed in hotels that have been blown up. They don't exist anymore. Not because I stayed there, but there's been a few of them. I have seen attractions come and go. I've been to many, many of the long running shows out there, eaten in many of the restaurants, explored the area like Hoover Dam, Red Rocks, Valley of Fire, Zion Canyon. I never did make it out to Death Valley. That's on my wish list. So now, having said that, I might just, if three things line up, I might just make one last trip to CES, kind of do a victory lap since I missed it this year. But it would have to be no major COVID outbreak in Vegas. Right now they're good, but who knows, that could change. Number two, if the show is held, virtually, or my understanding is they're going to do it both in person and virtually, and that would depend again on a COVID outbreak. And number three, because it's a 5-hour flight for me, is all this craziness that you hear about happening on airplanes with people that don't want to be masked and getting into fights with flight attendants and all that. I flew to Chicago back at the end of July to go to a sports card show, the biggest one there is. That was a 2-hour flight. Everybody was masked. Everybody was very cooperative. It wasn't a big deal, but 5 hours on a plane is very different. So I don't know. Don't hold me to it. There's a possibility I might go out there, but all the stars have to align for me to say I'm going to do it, because otherwise, forget it. I'm not going to do it anymore.
Well, regardless of whether you go to one last CES for a victory lap, it has been a tremendous career. And I thank you very much, not only for your many contributions to Sound and Communications, but also for taking some time to kind of reminisce and go over those stories with us. As you alluded to, we're planning to publish in Q4 a longer form reminiscence about your career and some of the highlights of it. So readers can look forward to that in Q4. But other than that, once again, thank you for your time. And thank you for all your contributions to Sound and Communications this last 10 plus years.
My pleasure. And I'll leave you with a classic Duke Ellington stinger outro. How's that?
Perfect ending. Thank you very much, Pete. This is Dan Ferrisi with Sound and Communications Magazine. Thank you once again, Pete Putman, for all your
and remember, ask better questions. Don't forget that. Oh, and by the way, buy whatever television you want. I don't care anymore. They're so cheap now that if you don't like it, just chuck it at the end of the year and get another one.
Words of wisdom to close us out. Thank you once again.
Yeah. Bye-bye.